So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today we're actually going to continue with the tafsir. So, yesterday we were actually doing with Surah al-Ma'idah. Well, we're still there, doing Surah al-Ma'idah, and with Surah al-Ma'idah, of course, we're still on the third ayah. So, Alhamdulillah, we're little by little going farther and farther. So, really need to have the patience to make sure that when, of course, we continue an ayah, we need to make sure that we're getting all over into understanding all the different details in the ayat. All right, so وَمَا أُهِلَّ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ بِهِ. So here we go. We started off with حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمُ الْمَيْتَةُ وَالدَّمُ وَلَحْمُ الْخِنْزِيرِ وَمَا أُهِلَّ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ بِهِ. And of course, we were basically talking about yesterday, we talked about al-Maita. We also talked about the dead, of course, and what actually makes a dead animal. And we also talked about blood, and what about the blood that is within the food? How do we understand what is permissible, what is not permissible? We also talked about lahm. We went in details in regards to swine, or at least pork meat, and what is permissible, what is not permissible. We also talked about uh, the different rulings, or at least the differences of opinions in regards to gelatin. So we went in details with that, and certainly there's so much always to say. وَمَا أُهِلَّ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ بِهِ. We talked about some of what was given into, of course, into at least slaughtering for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we went in that. And al-munkhaniqatu wal-mawqudatu wal-mutaraddiya. So we talked about the different animals that died in different ways, whether thrown out from high, or whether we're speaking about that ones that were hit on their heads, or whether the ones that were basically battling each other, different animals, whether it was a wild animal or even the animals battling each other themselves. And we also left off at, let's see, we left off at what makes a dhaka. So we use the word dhaka to mean halal sacrificed animals, and we talked about before the hunting, and we said that to make the story short, if the tool that was used basically for hunting, it basically led to the termination of that animal's life. In other words, we're not talking about the side of the tool, but we're speaking about the actual tool leading to the death of that animal, and not that animal basically falling or dying as a result of the fall, or probably as a result of falling in water and eventually drowning, but as a result of that target. And of course, we did talk about the different tools that are used, whether we're speaking about the tools such as a gunshot, or whether we're speaking about tools like knives, or whether tools that basically would be, of course, gunshot we're talking about in case of hunting. But of course, in case of dhaka, where we're speaking about animals that are home animals and not wild animals roaming around, in that situation, there's only one way to do it, which is by dhaka. In other words, taking the animal, slaughtering it by simply slaughtering certain sides of the animals. And of course, we're going to talk about that, because with dhaka, I think it's important to speak about one very important thing. We're going to take that right there, and we also went in details in regards to animals, or at least what actually makes dhaka, and we went in details in that regard. So let's right there actually get you to see one side. We also talked about the animals that are pregnant, right? And if the baby basically dies within the mother's womb, what happens then? What is the ruling in that regards? And we went in details, and of course, and that. And I thought it would be important. I wanted to actually show you this piece of it. Let's look at it. So when you're looking at what, let me see what you can see. Okay, you're looking at the scholars, and they basically had differences of opinions on what actually makes the actual cutting. In other words, what makes an official and what is necessary in order to slaughter, what makes it necessary to cut. So let's see, we're looking at what the word is fara, and certainly fara actually means to cut or bring about a slaughter. And what we're slaughtering is basically al-awdaj. When we're looking at al-awdaj, we're basically looking at certain sides in the animal. And anharaddam. Anharaddam actually means in where there's a gushing of blood, a gushing of blood, to make sure that all the different contaminations in the animal are basically departing the animal and not something that we are consuming. So I thought it would be important to basically share this this image right here, and we're looking at the different things that scholars actually had differences of opinions on how much is a slaughter and what actually makes a slaughter. So let's see here. I want to show you, this is the basically the anatomy of a cow, and I thought it would be good to basically help you understand. Let's see, here we go. So Malik and Jama'a. So basically the madhab Maliki, that it is not permissible, and would it be considered dhaka, i.e. basically an actual dhabiha, an actual slaughter, unless al-hulqum wal-wadajain, unless it was basically slaughtering the throat and of course al-wadajain. Now I want you to look at al-wadaj here, or even al-mari'. Now I want to, of course, this is basically, I'm not going to go in all the details, whether we're speaking about hulqum al-mari', which basically let's right there, because even in English, most people don't really know what these words mean. So we're just going to basically help you see that piece of it. So we're looking at here's the trachea, the pharynx, and esophagus, spinal cord. Those are basically the different areas. And of course, when we're speaking about what actually makes a slaughter, is it by basically right there separating or slaughtering the trachea, or is it by slaughtering the esophagus, or is it by slaughtering the spinal cord? Okay, so at the end, we do know that by slaughtering up to at least the esophagus, that you would get basically that the gushing of blood. And does that necessarily make it that that's the end of it, or is there more to it? So that's what we're trying to get to. Is there more to it? And that's why scholars actually had differences of opinions in that regards, because they had differences of opinions on where is the ending. They did agree that if you were to cut the whole thing, that is trachea, esophagus, spinal cord, and certainly that brings the final termination of the animal's life, then that basically means that you had completed the slaughter, therefore the biha. But then they had differences on if it was done without cutting the spinal cord, whether that actually acts as completion, or what if it was done halfway, then the person comes back and basically completes the rest, maybe in the beginning of it up to here, they somehow got scared because the animal was moving, or they got scared all of a sudden, they didn't complete it, and then they continued. So we're just wondering whether we're worried whether this animal died as a result of the actual slaughter, or whether they died of suffocation. That's what we worry, because if the animal died as a result of suffocation, then in that situation, this animal would be haram to consume, because they would be considered as mawquda, or would be considered as basically as in the ayah right there where it was telling you al-munkhaniqa. So it would be then munkhaniqa if we probably didn't do the process right. So looking at that picture, so you've got all this area. So do we slaughter from here, or do we slaughter from here, or do we slaughter from here? All of that, if we're basically here, let's say, cutting the trachea, cutting the esophagus, cutting the spinal cord, then that would actually be permissible. But like I said, to make the story short, because I don't want to confuse you with all those differences of opinions and who actually said what and all of that, just understand right where they had differences of opinions on how far, but then they also had differences of opinions. What if the cut was actually done from the back? So instead of cutting and starting the cut from here, this person started the cut from the back and basically started, of course, from the back and started cutting the spinal cord and going this way. And of course, definitely, if you're cutting from this way, then what you're doing is that you're cutting all the blood supply. You're cutting definitely right there, even the source of what gives air, what gives food, what gives certainly that connection with the blood supply right there with the heart, etc. Therefore, you will see the gushing blood despite. But with a spinal cord, definitely, when we're speaking about the animals with the spinal cord, if you're cutting the spinal cord, definitely you are disabling it from movement. So that's probably one reason why many times in slaughter homes, they might hit it on its brain, thinking that, well, now that we're getting this animal basically under our control, making it easier to simply just slaughter it later on. So looking at that, scholars actually had differences of opinions. If we're cutting from the back, not from the front, but of course, completing it this way. Now the sunnah, let's look at that one. The sunnah is that you would basically, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا ذَبَحْتُمْ فَأَحْسِنُوا الذِّبْحَ. If you slaughter the animal, then make sure you're basically completing it. Well, not only completing it, but you're actually being kind to the animal. How is it that I'm being kind to the animal when I'm actually terminating their life? So when you're slaughtering the animal in itself, its life has no purpose. So therefore, it is not necessarily evil to slaughter the animal because their purpose of life was really to be subjugated for human consumption, or at least for human use. So whether the human use was meant as to consume it in food, if it is permissible to consume in food, or whether the human use was for, let's say, skin, or even if we're talking about venom, or we're talking about different substances that are within the animal, then in that situation, it would be permissible for such consumption or such use. So that's why Islam had allowed that we would slaughter the animals that are in need, that were in need, and certainly in that situation, we would basically have to make sure that we are, as much as we can, being merciful, even when we are given the permission to slaughter such animal, that we are at least being merciful by reducing the amount of pain that they are facing as much as we can, to make sure that, one, that the actual knife is strong to reduce the amount of torture that it's facing, making sure as well that we're facing it to the Qibla. 3, making sure that we're making the dhikr. Number 4, making sure that we're not having one animal see the torture, or at least let's call it the slaughter, better wording for it, the slaughter of its own kind. All right, that way. And by the way, animals do feel. You'll be really surprised. I mean, animals do feel, and animals do recognize. And for those that actually want to think that it's only animals and say, well, that's why I'm vegetarian. In fact, Islam regarded that even plants feel. So if you're going to be thinking that only animals feel and not know and not know that even plants feel, and if you were to say, well, I'm going to feel with the animals but not going to feel with the plants, well, then in that situation you're really being myopic in your vision. And certainly if you're not going to be eating animals and not going to be eating plants because they too have feelings, well, then you had basically destined your life to one thing, which is you dying. And certainly no one would say that that is ethical. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarded consuming animals and certainly for survival. And same thing when we're speaking about plants, consuming plants for survival as well is actually permissible. So this is just one side. What is the evidence that plants even feel? The Prophet ﷺ, two things, the evidence that plants feel. Two evidence. Number one is that the Prophet ﷺ, during his time, there was a tree that the Prophet ﷺ used to sit or stand underneath to make his basically to do the khutbah or the ceremony or preach under this tree. But one time the tree was actually heard moaning. So the tree was moaning, and then the Prophet ﷺ, while all the Sahaba were hearing the tree moaning because the Prophet ﷺ had changed the spot of his preaching from underneath that tree to another spot, but the one that was hurt from moving the Prophet ﷺ from one spot to another was basically that tree. So it started moaning, and that's when the Prophet ﷺ put his hand on that tree because it was moaning. Another evidence that the Prophet ﷺ had told and asked the residents of Medina, because they were constantly beating on the tree. What tree? Well, basically the palm trees. He told them and asked them not to beat the trees and that they should basically respect the trees because they too can feel. Well, that's when the Sahaba, certainly, they applied what the Prophet ﷺ was telling them to do, but the trees the following year did not pollinate. That's when the Prophet ﷺ, he was approached that the trees didn't pollinate we your request that we would not hit the trees. But then that's when the Prophet ﷺ was basically told that we do that in order to help the trees pollinate, and we would strike on the trees to have certain pollens basically go to the other trees, and that's how we would get the food. That's how we would basically get the different dates coming from the trees. In other words, producing us the different production. That's when the Prophet ﷺ said, Antum a'lamu bi umuri dunyakum. You know more about the matters, the sciences that relate to your life. So we could see right there in where even plants have feelings. So if you're not going to be consuming plants because they have feelings, and if you're not going to be consuming animals, well, you're definitely destining yourself to be slaughtered and be killed. So in other words, hey, before you think about being a vegetarian, you need to really think about, are you going to be surviving with such an erroneous thought and such an erroneous ideology and vision? So you need to make sure that you would basically have your, let's call it your vision that basically teaches you about your life, what is considered ethical, what is considered not ethical or unethical. You basically want to take it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You want to make sure that you're understanding your vision in relationship with the world around you, that is ethics. You're understanding it from Quran and Sunnah. Now, right here, you could see that when we talked about, well, what if they were to basically go back and before even completing their slaughter. What is the ruling on that? And from there, basically, they said if he goes back and as soon as possible, in other words, before the animal is actually dead as a result of blocking the airway, in other words, and eventually having the animal be categorized and put in the category of dead as a result of munkhaniqa, or blocking the airway, you want to make sure that you're going to go back and complete the slaughter to make sure that you're getting a complete zakat, or a complete slaughter, or a complete, basically, the biha, right? Just to explain some things. Now, here's one thing. Yesterday I got a question saying, can women actually slaughter? أو in اللغة العربية حكم ذبح المرأة. But here's one thing, is that if we were to say in اللغة العربية حكم ذبح المرأة, it can actually mean the ruling of slaughtering women, and not necessarily thus the women slaughtering, but we're slaughtering the women themselves. Who becomes the object? It's basically the woman. All right. So it's, I received the question and I was like, wait a minute, what kind of a question is that? But that's when I thought, oh, these people are asking whether women themselves can perform the actual slaughter. So if she has the power and she has the ability, or at least, let's say, the guts. And what I mean by the guts, I mean the heart, the power to actually slaughter, then there's nothing haram in a woman slaughtering. So in that situation, of course, whoever has the power, ataqahu, whoever has the power, and min dhakarin aw untha, whether it was a male or a female, at the end of the day, it is permissible. Whether they had reached the age of puberty, didn't reach the age of puberty, whether this person is Muslim, or whether this person was from Ahl al-Kitab, it would be considered permissible to basically have them slaughter the animal. So this is just a piece of it. All right. So inshallah, just keep that one in mind. But certainly, the slaughter of a Muslim is better than the slaughter of a kitabi. Who's a kitabi? Kitabi is basically the person that is Christian or Jew. And of course, the only one that would slaughter, there's a difference between a nusuk. Okay, so for consuming that slaughter just basically for food, then in that situation, it would be permissible to have a kitabi even slaughter. But if we're doing a nusuk, basically a ritual, so basically for Hajj, the only one that would do in nusuk is basically, right there, is basically only a Muslim. Okay, now scholars had differences of opinions if the nusuk was done by a non-Muslim, Christian or Jew, on whether and why. Because in nusuk, we're talking about a ritual. We're talking about during Hajj or during Umrah. So that actually makes it a nusuk. Okay, nusuk to mean it's a ritual. Okay, they had differences of opinions on if the nusuk was done by a kitabi, by somebody from the people of the book, on whether it is permissible or not. To make the story short, majority of the Maliki, they regarded that no, a person from Ahl al-Kitab, they cannot do a nusuk, but they can do the actual animals that we're using for consumption outside of nusuk. Why? What's the difference between nusuk? Because a nusuk is a form of ibadah. A nusuk is a form of ibadah. So if we're talking about a nusuk, or a ritual is a form of worship, so that's why they basically had regarded that il-kitabi is not here supposed to be within this ibadah, within this worship, this ritual. So therefore, we're supposed to be having a Muslim do the job. Okay, let's see. And what if, here he said, istawhasha min al-insi. What does that mean? Istawhasha min al-insi. So basically, the animals that are considered domestic animals, okay, what if these domestic animals, they basically get wild? So what does that mean? I've got a cow, or I've got, well, I guess a cow is usually not smart enough to go and run away. But if we're talking about camels, they and goats, especially goats, not sheep, but goats, they can be pretty smart and outsmart you and actually run away. So in that situation, do these domestic animals get treated, and can we at all treat them like wild animals and actually hunt them? In other words, here's my domestic camel, and all of a sudden it basically ran away, and the only way for me to catch it is basically to, I guess, strike it with a rock, or probably maybe hey, shoot it from far. Basically, I'm hunting my own domestic animal. Okay. Is that permissible or not? So, although they had differences of opinion, some scholars said no, domestic animals are only to be slaughtered and not necessarily to be dealt like hunting or wild animals. And therefore, that's the first opinion, that no, it has to be basically, here we go, hunted. It cannot be hunted. It must be only through slaughter. The second opinion, they said no. If we get a domestic animal running away and acting like a wild animal, and we use the method of hunting, then in that situation, that makes it permissible. And the evidence for that, that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, إِنَّ لِهَذِهِ الْإِبِلِ أَوَابِدْ كَأَوَابِدِ الْوَحْشِ فَإِذَا غَلَبَكُم مِّنْهَا شَيْءٍ فَافْعَلُوا بِهِ هكذا. He said that, of course, that الإبل basically الإبل is basically the camels. They basically have, in other words, the what is the word? But they're susceptible to having some behaviors that is very similar to the behavior of wild animals. And therefore, in that situation, if they would overcome us, in other words, if this animal overcomes and is not dealing, or at least behaving like a domestic animal, and is right now behaving like a wild animal, then in that situation, treat it like a wild animal and basically do exactly what you would do with a wild animal. And if you needed to slaughter that wild animal slash domestic animal, then in that situation, the same rule that is applied to hunting can be applied on these domestic animals. But just keep in mind, not all scholars agree with that. So we're just here making the story short, inshallah. All right. Now, the other part, well, someone might say, let me just go back to the part, well, prove to me that if a woman were to slaughter the animal, that it would be considered permissible. All right. Someone might actually say that. So if you were to say, I need evidence from Quran and Sunnah, we would say everything is halal unless proven otherwise. There is no hadith or ayah that basically prohibited women from slaughtering animals. So therefore, we would not necessarily say that it is haram until or unless we've got any text, and certainly there's no text that prohibited women from slaughtering the animals. And therefore, a woman slaughter, if she's strong enough. And by the way, out on the countryside, ladies, we're really considered, I don't know, really soft ladies. But in the countryside, you'll really have those tough women right there that know no fear, and definitely really strong. Not only will they slaughter sheep, but they'll be having the power to actually slaughter cows as well. They'll be putting their hands. You'll start wondering whether these people actually have nerves. I mean, yeah, I'm metaphorically speaking, right? They'll have this power. They'll definitely be capable of doing a lot more than us soft ladies that are really, really overly domestic, I guess. And sometimes too soft to even cook a meal. But these women, they're pretty strong. Yep, you don't want to fight them. You don't want to deal with them. And you definitely want to respect that power that they have. All right, let's continue right there. Here's the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ was right there directing us and saying, إن الله كتب الإحسان على كل شيء فإذا قتلتم فأحسنوا القتلة وإذا ذبحتم فأحسنوا الذبحة وليحد أحدكم شفرته وليرح ذبيحته. Here's the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said that the Lord Almighty had decreed that we would act in piety or in kindness, at least, with everything. So if you slaughter, make sure you slaughter with kindness. And if you kill, make sure you kill with kindness. Of course, this is speaking about when we're applying the punishment, basically the laws of criminal law. And if you are to slaughter, then make sure you slaughter with kindness. وَلْيُحِدَّ أَحَدُكُمْ شَفْرَةً. How do we do that? If I were them, I would have actually put, instead of this comma right there, I would have actually put a semicolon in order to explain what it means to sharpen that tool that we're using in order to slaughter. And وَلْيُرِحْ ذَبِيحَتَهُ. So, of course, psychologically here speaking, or even making it comfortable. So, in other words, don't torture the animals and don't, for example, cut them up and slice them up while they're alive, because then you're basically just inflicting more and more torture and more pain. And certainly, if you are to slaughter the animal, then in that situation, they're only feeling certain pain for splits of a second. So that's why the Prophet ﷺ was telling us right there to reduce the amount of pain that they could be feeling by making sure that we're making the actual slaughter be as fast as possible by making that knife, or at least that tool, be as sharp as possible in order to make sure that we're reducing the amount of pain that they are going through. All right, so here this is basically right there. So let's see. قال علماؤنا. And of course, Al-Qurtubi is basically Maliki. So what he means by علماؤنا is basically the Maliki madhab. And he said, our scholars had said, إحسان الذبح في البهائم الرفق بها. To basically give kind slaughter is basically to make it with the least torture. فَلَا يَصْرَعْهَا بِعُنْفٍ. In other words, don't necessarily wrestle it with this amount of force, or even drag it, or even somehow, think that you could torture it before slaughtering. But what you have to do is basically right there, you want to make sure you sharpen the tool that you're slaughtering with. You're making sure that you've got the intention that this is done for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're facing it towards the Qibla, and you're basically slaughtering. Remember the esophagus, you're slaughtering the animal and simply the trachea and simply the spinal cord to make sure that this life is completely terminated, and therefore the animal is basically given the least pain, and certainly the least amount of pain possible. And of course, to let it rest. In other words, what we're talking about, let it rest, basically let that blood gush until it basically starts cooling, because it would be heated because of the blood actually right now leaving the body. It would start getting heated. It would be warm. Wait till it gets cool. That's a sign that the blood had basically departed and left the body. And the other part, in terms of the biha, it's basically just acknowledging that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you this ni'mah, had given you this blessing to slaughter or even consume such animals, and therefore you're taking the moment to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because these animals, they could have actually been the ones to overcome us and really be wild animals. And then in that situation, you would really not be capable of doing what you're doing, because all you would be capable of doing is just running away. So therefore, just acknowledge the submission that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put within these animals. As for ahsinul qitla, of course, what we're talking about in where ahsinul qitla, in other words, to basically, just give me a second right there. I'm trying to maintain the sound, and this, I guess the sound area keeps going down. So I'm trying to give so many different areas of focus, and that's making me lose my focus. All right. So inshallah, hopefully we'll say, maybe, I don't know what to do. Okay. Hopefully it's going to continue. Let's see, where is it? Okay, here we go. All right. So as for ahsinu al-qitla in the hadith, in where when, of course, in criminal law, there are certain laws in where if a person were to commit certain crimes, where they would basically be, what is the word? But putting themselves with only one choice, basically, in where capital punishment, which is basically the execution right there. Let's continue. The Prophet ﷺ naha an sharitat shaitan. What does that mean? That the Prophet ﷺ had forbid. Now the word kind of sounds different, because sharita can mean one, it can mean a sign, and it can mean the actual incision. So the sharitat al-shaitan would be the incision of shaitan, and what this is meaning and what this is referring to, in where the person making half slaughter and not a complete one, and definitely putting the animal really subject to only dying of pain and feeling the pain as it starts losing its life, losing its basically slowly losing its ability to move, its ability to basically get and regain its life. So in that situation, the Prophet ﷺ had basically forbid this type of slaughter, where it is halfway or even putting the animal subject to torture. Let's say the other piece in where right there, so we're done with all of that. وَمَا ذُبِحَ عَلَى النُّصُبِ. What does that even mean? ذُبِحَ عَلَى النُّصُبِ. So ذُبِحَ عَلَى النُّصُبِ. The word in nusub is basically, let's see, Ibn Faris. Who is Ibn Faris? So Ibn Faris was basically a scholar, and he also was a scholar in Lugha Arabiya as well. In fact, he wrote a book, it's called Fiqh al-Lugha. Fiqh al-Lugha, the word fiqh, usually it is relating to the science of Islamic legislature, but the word fiqh actually means understanding. So when we're speaking about fiqh al-lugha, we're talking about understanding the language. But here, of course, he said, "An-nusub hajarun kana yunsabu fayu'bad." He said what a nusub is, it was basically a rock, kind of like a statue that was sitting there, and they used to basically get blessings from it, or probably think that it would give them some good vibe or any of that sort. So that was basically what nusub is. And what they used to do near this monument, or this long stone, or whatever it is, they would basically take it and take even different animals and slaughter them right in front of this stone, thinking that it would actually get them some kind of a blessing, some kind of a good, hopeful future. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded was impermissible to slaughter near. In other words, any form of superstition, any form of worshiping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or believing that these actions would bring them some kind of a good future or some kind of blessings, is basically right there considered shirk and certainly considered haram to consume. Let's see, we're just going to go really fast. Ibn Jurayj, we talked about Ibn Jurayj before, and we said he was a scholar from Christian / Roman descent, and later on, of course, became one of the most important scholars. And he said that the Arab in Mecca used to slaughter in Mecca, that is the Arab before the time of Islam. We're speaking about the Arab that they're pagan Arab. And what they used to do is that when they slaughter, they used to take that blood and start painting it, or at least wiping it on top of this long stone monument, thinking that it would basically bring them some good luck. But when Islam came, Islam was straightforward in the where, although the Kaaba is definitely a monument right there, resembling, of course, the Tawheed that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was practicing. But of course, certainly to somehow slaughter and start wiping blood on the drapes or even on the walls of the Kaaba is basically impermissible. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically said in the ayah, لَن يَنَالَ اللَّهَ لُحُومُهَا وَلَا دِمَاؤُهَا. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in need of is not necessarily its flesh or even its blood. In other words, it's not the flesh or the blood here that makes some form of a ritual. It's basically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered that by you submitting to the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and slaughtering, that in itself is the ibadah. So the actual worship, the actual submission is basically in slaughtering the animal, and not necessarily by thinking that if I'm slaughtering the animal, I'm going to be taking the blood and starting to wipe it over, I guess, some holy site or masjid or whatever it is, or wiping it on yourself, thinking that somehow because this is a dhabiha and I'm going to wipe the blood on myself, that somehow it basically becomes a blessing. This definitely is not something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had permitted. It's only basically the slaughter that is permitted, but using blood or somehow thinking that by putting the blood on the wall or any of that sort, that's going to give you any form of good luck. All right. Anything that basically is done for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically considered as shirk to even eat. But let's just assume, okay? We're going to put a couple hypothetical questions here. Let's assume that the slaughter was done right. But then somebody comes up, I don't know, as they came up, we slaughtered an animal, we took this person, this auntie, to the farm, and we slaughtered the animal, everything was fine, Bismillah, Wallahu Akbar, faced it to the Qibla, we had done everything right, but then this auntie thinks that, hey, this blood is holy. And what she starts to do is taking this blood and starts putting it on herself, thinking that basically has some kind of cure for cancer, some kind of cure for future illnesses, because this is a dhabiha. Does that make the dhabiha itself haram? The answer is no. What she had done is an innovation, but the dhabiha itself was done right. Okay, the dhabiha itself was done right, unless this auntie, let's say it's an uncle now, this uncle, he basically thought, well, I want to make a halal dhabiha, I want to make something that is very special, so I'll basically here put, let's say, I don't know, wanted to slaughter and say, well, I'm going to put this animal on some kind of a stone, and then this stone, we're going to make it mark this very special day and this very special moment, and we're going to let this blood go on this monument to mark this special occasion, and basically let it be what we will commemorate as a special day, our anniversary on this day, our wedding on this day, and we're going to put this as a monument at our doorstep. This is part of nusub. Okay, this is part of nusub because it was done as a form of worship, as a form of ritual. Then in that situation, that would be haram, and that would be exactly like what the people of Quraysh used to do. Let's continue with this ayah right there in where وَأَن تَسْتَقْسِمُوا بِالْأَزْلَامِ. I want you to look at this. أَن تَسْتَقْسِمُوا بِالْأَزْلَامِ, in where what are al-azlam? So al-azlam are basically al-istiqsam. Let's al-istiqsam. So al-azlam, there are three types of azlam. Three types of azlam. Number one is where they used to actually do something that in where they used to al-azlam, in where they used to actually take certain things, and it's kind of like having exactly like a fortune telling type of thing, in where they would have three different arrows. The first one would say do, the second one would say don't do, and then these arrows do and don't do, and the third arrow would be this neutral thing, in where whenever they would have a dispute, they would basically go to this priest that is at, I guess, this place, and then the priest would basically direct them whether this person is to be considered, if there is a dispute, whether at fault or not at fault, or whether if they're disputing whether this person is supposed to be part of the family or not part of the family. And therefore, basically in that situation, they would say, well, this person, let's see what that priest is basically dictating. So they would go, and this priest would basically make a draw, and then the draw would say to do, not to do, or basically the third one, which is what would that priest direct them to do. All right, so this is al-istiqsam. The other form of al-istiqsam, in where whenever they wanted a certain provision, they would basically they would basically use some form of tanjim. What is tanjim? Some form of tanjim, it's exactly like the horoscopes. They would consider that there are certain celestial, or at least some kind of a relationship between what is in the skies, whether it's the stars or whether it's the way that the stars are moving, and that they had basically a relationship with their life and how their life and what happens in their life. So that was basically a common belief that the Arab had taken from the people that were living in Iraq, al-Ashuriyin, that this is what they believed at the time, in Babylonian, Ashuriyin, and they thought that there was a relationship, and certainly the Greek also had that as well. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had terminated such belief, or at least had regarded such belief, that there's any relationship between what happens in your life and whatever goes on within the space, that it has anything to do with your life, or even whether we're speaking about space or whether we're speaking about different things on earth, that there's no correlation between your future, between your past, and between whatever rotates in the skies, or whatever happens within the planets or stars, or even the different things on Earth, or even animals, that there's no correlation. And that's why if we're correlating these things that happen in our life with birds, so let's say what they used to do, if a crow were to fly, let's say the right side, if they were planning to travel and then they open the door, they find a crow. If it goes to the right, that means, hey, this is going to be a promising or an optimistic move. But if it flies to the left, they would basically be pessimistic, thinking that it's a bad omen or a sign of bad omen. So Islam came in to say that this is tiyara. Tiyara meaning superstition in regards to using the birds and thinking that the birds have any form of power to dictate or even know the future or the past. So therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا تَدْرِي نَفْسٌ مَاذَا تَكْسِبُ غَدًا. No soul knows what will happen to its future, and no soul knows what will happen not only tomorrow but in the future. And therefore that is a form of al-istiqsam. وَأَن تَسْتَقْسِمُوا بِالْأَزْلَامِ. The other thing they used to have is that they used to have 7 different, it was like containers, and those were next to Hubal. Hubal was an idol that they used to worship during the pre-Arabian era, during the Jahiliyyah. And of course, what was written in these containers or next to the Kaaba, or even right in the Kaaba, in situations where there is a dispute or at least someone committed a crime, they would go to these priests, and the priest would basically look into these containers that would say do not do, or whether the person owes a ransom for whatever crime that they had done, well, basically a compensation for the crime that they had done, which is the blood money, or whether they don't own anything, or whether it basically becomes something that they would have to compensate in a different manner. So Islam basically had considered that all of that is a form of superstition, and therefore brought an end to that. So when we're looking at al-istiqsam is to mean whether the person is seeking al-qasm wan-nasib. So whether the person was seeking a fair distribution, quote unquote, or whether they were seeking some form of seeking the future, that in itself is actually some form of istiqsam. And of course, all of that is considered a form of gambling, or a form of certainly because it leads to gambling. In English, when we say gambling, we're talking about somebody using gaming as a way to basically make money. Okay, so when we're looking at gambling, yes, definitely it is haram, and not necessarily based on this ayah, all right, but we're speaking about any form of where you're here betting on some money, or betting on someone, or betting on a draw, then that is a form of gambling in Islam. Okay, it's a form of gambling, and believing that anything or anyone has the power to know the future, has the power to direct even your, let's say, ethics or values. That's a form of taghut. What is taghut? Taghut comes from the root tagha. Tagha actually means to exceed the limit. So if a person exceeded the limit in where they misunderstood or were manipulating themselves and thinking that certain things control life, certain things control their fair distribution, then in that situation, that's a form of taghut. That's a form of certainly an unethical behavior. Now, because such behaviors were really common that people did, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded anything that leads to such behavior is also impermissible. So what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about things, whether it's playing with certain animals and thinking that they bring good luck, or whether it is playing with dice or chess or etc. That's basically the Prophet ﷺ had said that even if you are to basically put your hands and dip them in pig blood, that is better and even cleaner, even though it's not clean, but the contamination is even less than a person playing with dice or playing with chess. All right. Now, here's one thing. I'm not going to go in details with chess. I'm just going to, make the story short. So if the person is playing chess or with dice, all right, in wasting their time, or gambling through that way, and where if I lose the game, here's what you got to do. Here's what you owe me. And that's considered gambling. Okay, that's considered gambling. Why? Because the money that is invested should be bringing in prosperity to the society. Any money that is invested in where a person investing in a game and not something that is bringing a good production within the society would simply be considered a form of gambling, a form of safa. What is a safa? A safi is basically the person that puts an energy as wasted energy. In other words, what is wasted energy? Any form of energy, any form of energy that is not bringing in a good outcome, let's say coming from the other end, in where it is not bringing in prosperity to the society, is actually considered wasted energy, and that's a safa. So whether they're playing with chess, or whether they're playing with a dice, or whether they're playing with pigeons, or whatever it is, at the end of the day, it is considered a form of gambling.
Are you there? Assalamu alaikum.
He is one Maliki. Is why, let's see what he quoted. He said, and that is, and Khuwaizim in that, he said, that is why are basically the scholars had basically regarded any form of tanjim, any form of using horoscopes as basically an impermissible thing because of what it leads to. What does it lead to? Basically leads to the person losing hope, being pessimistic, and certainly wasting energy. If the person is wasting energy on such behaviors, then in that situation, it would basically be haram. Let's see. Tabari, Tabari, of course, from Iran. I want you to look at that. Look at, coming from different scholars. Iran actually was a main city, Asfahan, and certainly a number of different cities. They were considered areas for talab al-ilm. It's so sad that we're right now not visiting those areas or even seeing the legacy of the Muslims in those areas. That's one dream of mine, to visit Morocco and visit Iran. All right, inshallah, one day. All right, let's see. He basically said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid dealing with such items, whether we're speaking about horoscopes or whether we're speaking about al-istiqsam bil-azlam, because it was very common that people believed that it had the power to know the future. In other words, it was a form of shirk. All right. And, I want you to look at this one, in where he was defending a Shafi'i in where many had thought that when, for example, and I want you to look at this one, even though this is a little off topic, okay? Just a little off topic, but I think it's important to see how scholars did not necessarily see one scholar from another school, meaning madhab, as necessarily as an enemy, but they saw that it was actually part of being an ummah. So even though al-Qurtubi was Maliki, but I want you to look how he defended Shafi'i. He said, فَاسْتَنْبَطَ بَعْضُ الْجَاهِلِينَ. And of course, he's quoting here al-Tabari. He said, and some of the ignorant people, they basically thought that Shafi'i had said that to make a draw between the different slaves that a person might have. So let's say a person has 10 slaves, and he said, well, this year I'm going to start basically freeing my slaves one after another, but because I want to be fair on who I should free first, I'll just make a draw. Here it is. I'm writing the names of each and every single one, and then we're putting it in a basket and making a draw to see whose name comes out. And therefore, that would basically be choosing the person that is going to be freed this year. Let's just assume. And he said that this, by some, had claimed that it was a form of gambling. And look at right there, al-Qurtubi defending al-Shafi'i, or even al-Tabari defending al-Shafi'i, and he said, well, that's actually not true. In other words, Shafi'i is not defending, is not supporting an istiqsam, and is definitely not supporting gambling, because what this is relating in where it's basically to prevent any form of a dispute, and therefore it's basically to bring about an interest in where we're trying to bring about a fair relationship between the people, and that way they won't have this animosity between one another. So he said, well, what would be haram to do is somehow relating things to the future, in where betting on the future. That's what's haram, betting on the future, and therefore using different items, different elements, believing that these things have the knowledge to, or have the power, whether it's knowledge or power, to redirect what happens in the future. And he said, فَلَا يَجُوزُ أَنْ يُجْعَلَ خُرُوجُ الْقِدَاحِ عَلَمًا عَلَى شَيْءٍ يَتَجَدَّدُ فِي الْمُسْتَقْبَلِ. He said, and therefore, to have anything, and this is really common that sisters would call me. This is so common. Listen to this. This is very common that sisters would call me and say, hey, I'm getting this proposal, and ironically, today, especially today, I basically, had a flat tire today, and I went to get a coffee. The coffee machine broke down, and I basically went to fix the flat tire, but then all of a sudden my car breaks down in the middle of the way, and therefore, even giving a towing truck, and the towing truck that I basically got because my car broke down, even the towing truck broke down, and we got another towing truck, and that other towing truck got into a car accident. Is that a sign from Allah that this proposal that I'm getting is basically the wrong proposal for me? The answer is no. This is istiqsam. This is a form of superstition. Just because you got a flat tire, that, I don't know, coffee machine broke down or whatever it is, Just because you were just having a bad day, that is not necessarily a sign. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not send you signs, just around you. And yeah, here's a sign that this is bad for you. I'm making your car broke down. Do you get it? No, it doesn't work like that. In order to study the situation, whether this is good for you or not, you don't look for signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're not a prophet. You're not a prophet. So stop looking for signs that don't exist. Okay. What you need to do is basically look into whatever is basically the data. So let's say you're getting a proposal, you're looking at one, his deen, you're looking at his health, you're looking at his mental health, his responsibility, you're looking at his basically relationship with the family, you're looking at his income, how he's making it, how he's doing a good money management, fair distribution in his life. That's what you're researching. But to look elsewhere and expect a dream, or let me see you look for signs, you're looking at the wrong corner. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not send you signs, not to your istikhara, and certainly not to your answer because you're looking for something. Don't look and waste yourself into looking into these signs. Same thing. A lot of times sisters would tell me, the other day I was actually sitting down and all of a sudden my left ear starts making sounds. Well, I would say, see your doctor and make sure that your ears are cleaned. Or perhaps maybe I don't know, you probably were swimming and some water was still there, but that's not necessarily a sign that someone is talking about you or you're going to have a bad day. That's a form of superstition. Same thing. I would get sisters actually telling me that they basically had a sign in a dream where she was sleeping. She's basically seeing snakes right there coming, attacking her. Is that a sign that someone did magic on me, or a black spell or black magic on me? Or the other day, I dreamt that I basically was eating honey. The honey turned into a bunny or whatever it is. All right. Is that a sign that there's some hasad? No, there's that. Yes, there is dream interpretation. Okay, there is dream interpretation, but I want you to beware and be careful from using those types of notes and signs, thinking that that's a sign that I've got jinn, or that's a sign I've got sihr, or that's a sign that I have hasad, etc. Note, there is no way, okay? There is no text in the Quran or in the Sunnah or even in the books of fiqh that would give you signs or even a diagnose how to distinguish between whether you have magic done on you, or whether it's exorcism, or whether it is hasad. No one has the ability to really know that. I'll do ruqya, you can do ruqya, and possibly with some, I guess, with some experience, we might say, well, looking at the things that are happening to you, that's probably more likely to be hasad related or to be magic related. We could probably look into that, but to be definitive and actually say, yes, this is exorcism right there. The shaitan is right there sitting down in somehow your esophagus and somehow, trying to control your esophagus, or the jinn that's controlling you is this faith or that faith, is not necessarily accurate. And most of the times, those games would be played on women in particular. And of course, when they would go to these people, these people want to basically get your money. So what they would somehow make you believe that they have some hidden information that no one can get except through them, and that this hidden information, hey, they'll give you information which you cannot really verify. If I were to tell you this is magic, and this magic is hidden in the ocean, in some land or in some ocean and some shore in the Maldives, you've got no way to verify whether it's in the Maldives or whether it's in Africa or whether if it's even magic at all. But I'll tell you, and of course, you coming to me, I'll basically make you think that somehow I have this power to get some information that no one has the ability to get. And then basically, this becomes this tool that a lot of the scammers and certainly a lot of those liars would basically use on you and against you to make you feel that these people have the knowledge of the future or have the knowledge of the unseen, sihr, magic, whatever it is, hasad, and therefore they would basically abuse our ignorance. So be careful with that. Don't let anybody scam you in this way. And then, here's Islam coming to you and telling you what I want you to seek is basically being optimistic, and I want you to be hopeful. Yes, do ruqya, that's permissible, but I don't want you looking for signs that don't exist. I want you to look at the data and search whether this is right for you, the pros and the cons, and what actually looks promising. And certainly by studying history, you're knowing and having this window in where through it, you're going to be seeing more in regards to whether this is the right thing for you or not. Let's see. If we're talking about pessimism really being wrong, what about optimism? So what do we mean by that? Well, let's say here I am, I'm sitting down, or maybe I could actually do it this way, in where the Prophet ﷺ, let's start with that hadith in order to read through it. So the Prophet ﷺ, during al-Hudaybiyah, of course, the situation wasn't looking promising at all. Why? Because the people of Quraysh were gathered in order to, right here, stop and basically not allow the Muslims from entering the Kaaba. And therefore, they stopped them in the middle of the way. And when they stopped them in the middle of the way, it was basically here, no choice but to make some political agreements in order to make sure that the people of Quraysh are not attacking the Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ. After all, they did provoke them by somehow keeping Uthman ibn Affan away and spreading rumors that he was actually killed by the people of Quraysh. So they were definitely provoking the Muslims. But of course, different people were coming in to making a political agreement with the Prophet ﷺ in al-Hudaybiyah, until finally a guy named Suhail ibn Amr, later he becomes a Sahabi, but within the story right now, he didn't yet become Muslim. He comes in, and the Prophet ﷺ, when Suhail ibn Amr comes in as a delegate on behalf of the people of Quraysh, he said, Sahula amrukum, your matter is now going to be easy. What did he and where did he get that from? He basically got the inspiration from the name Suhail. So he said, Sahula amrukum. So having optimism, whether because of the name or whether because the situation is getting better. So optimism is permissible. Pessimism is not, because optimism, it's like, oh, here we go. It comes in Noura. Oh, now we're basically getting, inshallah, an enlightenment coming in, and things are going to look easy. Sister Martina comes in. Oh, I'm getting from her name that things are going to be powerful. Yep, we're going to be strong. We're going to be steadfast in this. Keep going. We're really getting this inspiration right there. Then in that situation, that is permissible. But to look at a pessimistic angle, and let's see a sister comes in, and let's say her name was Afia, and of course, in the northern Africa, to them, Afia just means it's a very bad omen, and where that's it, death is coming to you. And of course, the Easterners look at Afia as health is coming to you. Easterners to mean the eastern side of the Middle East, they would see it as Afia to actually mean health. The Western side of the Middle East, they would see it that it's actually fire. Ironically, I don't know why, but interesting. All right. So if a person were to say, well, here's Afia, and they used it to bring about optimism, then that's permissible. But if a person used the name to bring about pessimism, then in that situation, that's impermissible. Let's say, look at this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ actually said, أنا عند ظن عبدي بي. I am as my servant would think of me. Let's look at this hadith, in where this hadith was narrated by Bukhari and Muslim, and therefore this hadith is actually authentic. And what was the Prophet ﷺ basically telling us? That you need to keep that optimism, you need to keep the faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and basically that is what is going to determine a lot of the different things that happen to you. So you want to keep that pessimism away and always have your hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right. And of course, the difference, al-Khattabi, basically a scholar did a very important sharh for the book of Abu Dawood, Sunan Abi Dawood. What did he say? He basically said there's a difference between having optimism and using any form of superstition. He said what optimism brings is basically having hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when you basically have pessimism, you would basically relate to that, and you would lose hope in putting any effort to bring about change. And what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted you to do is put the effort, don't lose hope, and basically end up becoming, let's say, a hostage to believing that this bird, basically, whether it's a bird or whether it's a name or whether it's your car breaking down or whatever it is, thinking that these things control your effort. Continue with the effort. Make sure you fix your vision and don't necessarily succumb to the different things that surround you, thinking that they will control your future or control your effort. It's all about the amount of effort that you would put in, but it's good to have at least the inspiration, the good inspiration, and basically be optimistic that things are going to head towards the right direction. So this is basically the difference in where the Prophet ﷺ said, لا طيرة وخيرها الفأل. قيل يا رسول الله وما الفأل يا رسول الله وما الفأل؟ قال الكلمة الصالحة يسمعها أحدكم. So the Prophet ﷺ, he basically said, لا طيرة وخيرها الفأل, that there is no superstition in birds, and what is basically best is to have optimism. And when they asked, well, what is optimism? The Prophet ﷺ said, well, a good word that one might hear, in other words, what optimism are we talking about? Not, oh, well, here it is, it's a birthday cake coming in, and therefore, oh, we're basically probably going to have a future where we're going to have 10 kids or whatever it is. No, you cannot use this as some form of superstition. What you need to do, but it is good to look at as al-kalima salihah yasma'uha ahadukum, to hear a good word. In other words, pass good words to bring about optimism, to bring about support, to bring about good advocacy. That's basically what would bring a change in a person's spirit, and therefore that's where we're basically supporting people to head towards towards making the right choices in life, to making basically a hopeful future rather than feeling that they're going to be losing everything. So how do we learn that? Well, the Prophet ﷺ actually said, look at this hadith. Sorry, everyone, I'm not using the cursor frequently because I'm trying to basically equalize the sound. It's not wanting to stay put. My daughter's helping me put that equalizer in place at 100% to make sure that the sound is not going low. Let's see, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ والحلم بالتحلم ومن يتحرى الخير يعطى ومن يتوقى الشر يوقع. All right. And وثلاثة لا ينالون الدرجات العلى من تكهن أو استقسم أو رجع من سفر من طيرة. I want you to look at this hadith in where the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ. Seeking ilm does not come with thinking that, oh, I'm going to make, a moment of sitting down and somehow getting an inspiration from outside. No, it actually comes through studying. Put the effort in seeking knowledge and in studying, and that's how you're going to get the education. Same thing. Al-hilm bit-tahallum. What is al-hilm? Al-hilm is forbearance. When someone harms you, you're basically taking in that moment to maintain, of course, your impulsivity from you being impulsive or retaliating in an emotional way. You're basically taking the time to hold a grip on yourself, to making sure that you're acting and you're behaving in a way that is maintaining your morality. And certainly that's it. tahallum. وَمَن يَتَحَرَّى الْخَيْرَ يُعْطَهُ. يَتَحَرَّى الْخَيْرَ, in where if you're seeking good, it's basically going to come to you. وَمَن يَتَوَقَّى الشَّرَّ يُوقَهُ. And if you were to avoid harm, that's basically going to be the way and the key to keep different harm away from you. In other words, you have to put the effort in order to make sure that you're keeping harm away from you, whether it's eating healthy. So in that situation, okay, you're avoiding illness. Well, that's not a form of pessimism. That's actually a form of investing good or avoiding evil. So to avoid evil is basically the way to help you stay away from harm. وثلاثة لا ينالون الدرجات العلى. There are three people that would not get the high levels, and number one, in other words, they would not get anywhere. Number one, whoever would seek any form of superstition or use any form of using different forms of superstition and trying to basically use this draw type of thing, or even a person that would come back and come back from their journey and basically say, well, I basically saw this as a bad omen or an omen right there, and therefore I'm going to consider that as the tool on whether to make it this decision or that decision. In that situation, that would simply be considered as a form of superstition. So inshallah, we're going to continue tomorrow, inshallah, in our tafsir. Sorry, I think because today we had al-Aqidah, and right now I think I'm getting worn out. So I'm going to end right there. And inshallah, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. This is it, inshallah. All right, I guess no one has any questions. So inshallah, we'll see you tomorrow with our tafsir.
We are having late registration for the summer semester courses, the Aqidah course, the Foundations of Faith, our Tazkiyah course, the Heart Purification course, as well as the Seerah course, the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if anyone is interested in joining, the registration will be through till Monday, inshallah. So you can go ahead and go to www.gemsoflight.org and go ahead and register. Jazakallah khair.
وإياكم. So inshallah, registering would basically help you, inshallah, keep whatever you're attending, basically, inshallah, get a certificate for it, and hopefully, inshallah, also for you to really know how much you benefited and to really have at least this overview to make sure that you really are at least getting, I don't want to say tested, but at least you are having, at least by the teachers that are teaching those subjects, get an overview of whether you really understood things right, how far did you really go with understanding a lot of the different material, and certainly how much did you grasp? Do I need to put in more effort? Do I need to, do I need to use different methods? Do I need to listen to the lecture more than once, etc.? All these different things are basically to help you keep track with your ilm. So this is it, inshallah. We'll see you tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.